In the early years of the 20th century, the age of exploration was narrowing. Most of the world's coastlines had been mapped. Trade routes were established. Steamships crossed oceans on predictable schedules. Yet, at the far southern edge of the planet, one region remained largely unknown. Antarctica was still a place of blank spaces, shaped more by rumor and theory than by experience. It was toward this unfinished edge of the map that a ship named Endurance was built. She was constructed in 1912 in Sandefjord, Norway, a town with long experience in polar whaling ships. Her original name was Polaris, but she was purchased soon after completion by the British explorer Ernest Shackleton and renamed Endurance, a word chosen deliberately. Shackleton had taken it from his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." The ship was designed not for speed but for survival. Her hull was made of thick oak planks, reinforced with greenheart, a dense tropical wood known for its strength. The timbers were laid close together, creating walls far thicker than those of ordinary ships. The bow was shaped not to cut through ice, but to rise against it. When pressure came, the intention was that the ship would be lifted upward rather than crushed between floes. This was the theory, at least. Endurance was about 44 meters long, with 3 masts for sailing and a coal-fired steam engine that could be used when wind failed. She carried no luxury. Space below deck was limited and functional. Cabins were narrow. Passageways were tight. Everything aboard had to justify its weight. Ships built for polar work accepted certain trade-offs. They were slow. They were difficult to maneuver. They rolled heavily in rough seas. But they were meant to endure pressure, cold, and isolation in ways that ordinary vessels could not. Even so, no ship could truly be designed for what lay ahead. Shackleton's goal was ambitious, but carefully defined. He did not seek to reach the South Pole that had already been accomplished by Roald Amundsen in 1911. Instead, Shackleton planned to cross the Antarctic continent from one side to the other, passing through the South Pole along the way. It would be the first land crossing of Antarctica, a journey of nearly 3,000 kilometers over ice and unknown terrain. The plan depended on precision. Endurance would carry Shackleton and his main party to the Weddell Sea, where they would land on the Antarctic coast. From there, a transcontinental march would begin. A second ship, Aurora, would approach from the opposite side of the continent, laying supply depots for the final stages of the crossing. The success of the entire expedition rested on timing, weather, and coordination across vast distances. The ship herself was central to everything. She carried not only men, but dogs, sledges, scientific instruments, coal, food, boats, and the accumulated expectations of an era that still believed unexplored spaces could be crossed with sufficient resolve. On deck, Endurance appeared compact and solid, her hull painted black and her superstructure white. Below deck, every corner was filled with supplies. Coal bunkers were packed tight. Food was stored in tins, sacks, and crates. There was little room to move once everything was loaded. Polar ships were never comfortable. Cold seeped through every surface. Moisture condensed on walls and ceilings. Clothing dried slowly, if at all. The smell of coal smoke, damp wool, animals, and unwashed bodies blended into a single persistent atmosphere. This was accepted as normal. What mattered was function. Endurance was not meant to be admired. She was meant to survive pressure from ice that moved slowly, irresistibly, and without regard for human planning. By the time Shackleton prepared to sail in 1914, Europe stood on the edge of war. News of rising tension spread even as supplies were loaded. When war broke out, Shackleton briefly offered his ship and crew to the British government. The offer was declined. Exploration, it seemed, would continue alongside conflict. and so the expedition proceeded. Endurance was stocked, crewed, and prepared for departure. Her hull bore the marks of careful craftsmanship, but also the limits of human knowledge. No one aboard could truly know how the Weddell Sea would behave in the coming months. The ship waited at anchor, heavy with coal and expectation. Ahead lay ice, darkness, and distance. Behind lay the last familiar shore. Endurance was ready to sail, not because she was invincible, but because she was as strong as her builders could make her, and that, for the moment, was enough. A ship alone could not cross the Antarctic ice. It required people whose skills matched the demands of isolation, cold, and long uncertainty. Ernest Shackleton did not select his crew through formal applications alone. Some men were recruited through personal connections. Others answered a now famous notice calling for volunteers for a hazardous journey, offering small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return. Doubtful. Whether every man had read those exact words mattered less than the understanding they shared. This was not ordinary work. The final crew of Endurance numbered 28. They came from different backgrounds and countries, but each held a role that served the whole. There were officers responsible for navigation and command. Sailors handled the rigging and deck work. Engineers maintained the steam engine and boilers. Scientists recorded weather, ice conditions, and magnetic readings. A carpenter stood ready to repair damage. A cook was tasked with feeding men under conditions where fuel and ingredients would steadily diminish. Life aboard was structured but informal. Rank mattered during work and watch rotations, but daily interactions were close and unavoidable. The ship's interior offered little privacy. Hammocks and bunks were stacked tightly. Personal belongings were minimal. Each man learned quickly that cooperation mattered more than comfort. Supplies were chosen carefully. Food had to survive long storage in cold and damp conditions. Much of it came in tins, preserved meat, vegetables, soups, and puddings. Hard biscuits formed a daily staple. Sugar, tea, cocoa, and flour were carried in bulk. Fresh food would be limited to what could be eaten early or obtained later through hunting. Coal was precious. It fueled the steam engine and provided heat for cooking. Every shovelful mattered. Lighting was limited, often reduced to oil lamps during a long polar night. Fuel management would become a daily concern long before shortages became critical. Dogs were brought aboard for sledging. They occupied a noisy and confined space on deck, cared for daily, fed from stores that had to be protected as carefully as human rations. Their presence added warmth and movement to the ship, but also complexity. They needed food, attention, and discipline. 3 lifeboats were carried. They were heavy, solidly built, and designed for rough seas. At the time, they were seen as insurance necessary, but unlikely to be used for anything more than emergency transport between ice and shore. Scientific instruments filled crates. Thermometers, barometers, sextants, chronometers, and notebooks were stored alongside practical tools. Shackleton intended the expedition to contribute knowledge as well as achievement. Observations would be made whenever conditions allowed. Clothing was selected for function, not style. Wool layers, heavy coats, mittens, and fur-lined boots filled the holds. Waterproof garments were limited. Dampness would be an ongoing challenge. Dry clothes were a luxury that could not always be maintained. Before departure, the men learned the routines of shipboard life. Watches were assigned. Maintenance tasks rotated. The engine was tested. Sails were raised and lowered repeatedly. Each man learned not only his own duties, but enough of others' work to step in if needed. The social balance mattered. Shackleton paid attention to temperament as much as skill. He believed that endurance depended not only on strength, but on the ability to live together under pressure. Disagreements were addressed early. Humor was encouraged. Silence, when it came, was respected. By the time Endurance finally prepared to sail south, the ship was heavy with supplies and heavier with intention. Everything that could reasonably be anticipated had been considered. Every crate and barrel represented a future need. Nothing extra could be carried. Nothing essential could be left behind. The men boarded knowing that resupply would not be possible once the ice closed. Ahead lay months of dependence on what they had chosen to bring with them. And so the crew settled into their narrow spaces, surrounded by food, fuel, tools, and one another, as Endurance prepared to leave familiar waters and enter a region where planning would soon meet conditions beyond anyone's control. Endurance left England in the summer of 1914, moving first through familiar waters before turning gradually toward the southern oceans. At the outset, the voyage felt almost ordinary. Harbors passed behind them. Coastal landmarks faded. The ship rolled gently in temperate seas, her sails set more often than her engine used. For many of the crew, this was a period of adjustment. They learned the rhythms of long-distance travel, watches divided into steady intervals, meals taken at fixed times, maintenance tasks repeated day after day. Decks were scrubbed. Rigging was checked. The engine was run periodically to keep it ready. Even during calm weather, there was always work to be done. Below deck, life remained close and communal. The ship's narrow spaces forced constant proximity. Clothing hung wherever it could dry. Boots were stored near bunks to keep them from freezing later in the voyage. The smell of coal smoke mixed with damp wool and cooking food. These were conditions the men would grow used to, long before discomfort became more serious. As the ship moved farther south, subtle changes began to appear. The air cooled, winds sharpened, days shortened slightly. Seabirds unfamiliar to northern waters followed the ship for long stretches, circling silently above the masts. The ocean darkened in color, and swells became longer and more forceful. Stops were made along the way. At ports, coal was taken aboard. Fresh provisions were added where possible. News from the outside world reached the ship in fragments, including reports of the war now unfolding in Europe. For the moment, the expedition remained separate from it, moving steadily toward a different kind of uncertainty. By late 1914, Endurance reached South Georgia, a remote island in the southern Atlantic. The island served as the last outpost of civilization before Antarctica. Whaling stations operated along its shores, their presence marked by smoke, machinery, and the smell of processed whale oil. Here, Shackleton gathered information about ice conditions farther south. The reports were not encouraging. Whalers spoke of heavy ice in the Weddell Sea, worse than usual for the season. Ships had struggled to make progress. Some had been forced to turn back earlier than expected. These warnings were noted, but not allowed to halt the plan entirely. Time mattered. The Antarctic summer was short. Delay risked missing the narrow window when landing on the continent would still be possible. After careful consideration, Shackleton decided to proceed. Additional supplies were taken aboard. Dogs were exercised on land. Repairs were made where possible. Then the ship departed once more, leaving the last sheltered harbor behind. Beyond South Georgia, the Southern Ocean revealed its full character. Winds strengthened. Waves grew steeper. Spray froze on contact with the deck. Ice appeared first as small fragments, then as broader fields that forced careful navigation. The engine was used more frequently now, pushing the ship through openings between flows. Each day required closer attention. Lookouts were posted constantly. Changes in wind and current were noted. Progress slowed as the ship picked her way through ice that resisted easy passage. The men observed quietly. This was no longer a routine voyage. The environment was asserting itself, not suddenly, but steadily. Every mile south required effort. Every decision carried weight. Ahead lay the Weddell Sea, a region known for trapping ships and holding them fast. Behind lay open water that was already beginning to feel distant. As Endurance continued southward, her movement became more deliberate. Her pace dictated not by human intention, but by the shifting boundaries of ice that now defined the limits of what was possible. Beyond the shelter of South Georgia, the character of the journey changed decisively. The Weddell Sea lay ahead, a vast, ice-filled basin on the eastern side of the Antarctic Peninsula. It was a region known less for open water than for movement that was slow, unpredictable, and resistant to passage. Ice here did not simply form and melt with the seasons. It drifted, compressed, and rotated under the influence of wind and current, creating barriers that could close without warning. For Shackleton, the Weddell Sea represented both opportunity and risk. If the ship could reach the Antarctic coast, the crossing of the continent could begin as planned. But the same ice that preserved the coastline also guarded it. Few vessels had entered the Weddell Sea and returned on schedule. As Endurance pushed southward in January 1915, the ice thickened. What had once been scattered floes became wide fields of packed ice. Channels narrowed. The ship's progress slowed to a crawl. At times, sails were lowered entirely, and the engine worked steadily to force the hull forward through pressure ridges and slush. The sound of ice against wood became constant. It scraped along the hull, producing low groans and sharp cracks that echoed through the ship's frame. These noises were not immediately alarming. Polar ships were built to withstand them, but they served as a reminder that the vessel was now moving within a material that behaved neither like land nor sea. Navigation required continuous attention. The officers searched for leads, narrow lanes of open water that could carry the ship forward for a short distance before closing again. Progress often came in brief advances followed by long pauses. The ship would move, stop, reverse, and try again. The men adapted to the rhythm. Work continued despite the cold. Ice was chipped from rigging and deck fittings to prevent dangerous accumulation. Watches were adjusted to account for fatigue. Meals remained regular, though eating in heavy clothing became normal. Weather added to the difficulty. Visibility shifted rapidly. Fog could appear without warning, obscuring ice fields ahead. Winds changed direction, pressing floes together or pulling them apart unpredictably. The ship's position had to be checked constantly to avoid becoming trapped between converging masses of ice. Despite the challenges, morale remained steady. At this stage, the ice was still seen as an obstacle to be managed, not a threat that could end the expedition. Shackleton maintained a measured optimism, encouraging patience rather than urgency. The ship, he believed, was built for exactly this kind of environment. Yet the Weddell Sea allowed no simple victories. Each mile gained felt temporary. Channels closed behind the ship as quickly as they opened ahead. At times, progress for an entire day amounted to little more than a few ship lengths. By mid-January, the situation grew more constrained. The ice pressed closer on all sides. The ship's ability to maneuver diminished. Turning became difficult. Reversing required careful coordination between engine and helm, and even then movement was uncertain. The men watched the ice closely now. They noted its texture, its movement, the way pressure lines formed and shifted. These observations were recorded, but they also carried an unspoken concern. The behavior of the ice suggested forces beyond direct control. When Endurance finally slowed to a near standstill, there was no single moment that marked the change. No sudden impact. No clear decision point. The ship simply ceased to move forward. She rested among the floes, surrounded by ice that creaked and shifted quietly around her hull. For the moment, she remained intact and upright. But the Weddell Sea had begun to assert its full influence. And from that point onward, time, rather than distance, would become the primary measure of progress. By late January 1915, it became clear that Endurance was no longer navigating the ice. She was part of it. The ship lay motionless, held fast by packed floes that extended in every direction. What open water had existed days earlier had closed again, compressed by shifting winds and currents. Attempts to work the ship free produced little result. The engine strained against resistance that did not yield. At first, the situation did not appear critical. Shackleton and his officers believed the ice might loosen with a favorable change in weather. This had happened to other ships in polar waters. Patience, rather than force, was considered the sensible approach. Coal was conserved. The engine was shut down for long periods. Sails hung slack against frozen rigging. The ship entered a state of enforced waiting. Life aboard adjusted accordingly. Watches were shortened. Routine maintenance continued, but movement was limited. Ice accumulated around the hull and had to be cleared regularly to prevent uneven pressure. Men worked with picks and shovels, chipping away at ridges that pressed against the ship's sides. The surrounding ice was not static. Floes drifted slowly, rotating and grinding against one another. Long cracks opened without warning, then sealed again just as suddenly. The soundscape changed. Instead of waves and wind, the men heard groans, pops, and deep rumbling vibrations transmitted through the hull. Below deck, conditions remained stable for the moment. The ship's structure held firm. The temperature dropped steadily, but heating could still be managed with careful use of coal. Meals were warm, if repetitive. The cook adapted recipes to available ingredients, stretching rations without making their scarcity obvious. Psychologically, the shift was subtle but important. The expedition had moved from active travel to passive endurance. Days passed without change in position. Navigation charts remained untouched. Progress was measured in observations rather than miles. Shackleton worked deliberately to maintain morale. He encouraged regular activities, exercise on deck when weather allowed, games, shared reading, and communal meals. Structure gave shape to days that might otherwise blur together. Yet beneath the routine, awareness grew. The ship was drifting, not south toward the continent, but slowly northward with the ice. The currents of the Weddell Sea were carrying Endurance away from her intended landing point. This movement was slow enough to seem insignificant, but over weeks it became unmistakable. The men noted landmarks on the horizon shift relative to the ship. Position readings confirmed what observations suggested. They were no longer approaching Antarctica. They were being carried sideways and back. Attempts to cut a channel through the ice were made. Crews worked for hours, sawing and breaking floes ahead of the bow. Progress gained in this way lasted minutes at most. The ice closed again as soon as effort stopped, erasing the work as if it had never been done. By February, the reality could no longer be ignored. Endurance was trapped for the season. There would be no landing on the Antarctic continent that year. The plan to begin the transcontinental crossing had quietly dissolved, replaced by a simpler and more immediate objective: keep the ship intact and survive the coming winter. The men adjusted their expectations. Clothing was reorganized for long-term cold. Sleeping arrangements were altered to retain heat. Supplies were inventoried again with a more conservative eye toward consumption. Outside, the sun dipped lower each day. The ice field stretched unbroken to the horizon, a surface that reflected light sharply and offered no clear direction. The ship lay still among it, her dark hull, a narrow interruption in a landscape that now defined the limits of movement. The expedition had entered a new phase, one governed not by exploration, but by endurance in its most literal sense. As autumn faded into the Antarctic winter, endurance remained locked in place. By March 1915, daylight shortened rapidly. The sun traced low arcs across the horizon before disappearing entirely for long stretches. Darkness became the prevailing condition, broken only by moonlight, starlight, and the faint glow of oil lamps inside the ship. Cold intensified. Temperatures dropped well below freezing and remained there. The wooden hull contracted and expanded with shifting conditions, producing sharp cracks and deep creaks that echoed through the ship at all hours. These sounds were unsettling but familiar to those experienced with polar vessels. Daily life adapted to the absence of movement. Watches were reorganized to maintain essential tasks rather than navigation. Ice was cleared from decks and rigging to prevent dangerous accumulation. Snow was collected and melted for water, conserving stored supplies. Below deck, living spaces grew more crowded. The men spent longer hours indoors, sharing narrow cabins and communal areas. Hammocks and bunks were arranged to retain warmth. Clothing was layered constantly. Damp garments rarely dried completely, and frost formed on walls and beams where breath condensed. Food became a central focus. Rations were still sufficient, but careful management was necessary. Tinned foods dominated meals. Fresh meat came occasionally from seals or penguins when hunting conditions allowed, providing both nutrition and variety. These hunts were conducted sparingly, mindful of ammunition and effort. Cooking in the cold required planning. Fuel use was monitored closely. Meals were prepared efficiently, with heat used for multiple purposes whenever possible. Hot food and drink became important not only for nutrition but for morale. Routine helped stabilize the mind. Shackleton encouraged regular schedules, shared meals, and communal activities. Games were organized, books circulated, musical instruments appeared in the evenings. These small structures imposed order on a season that might otherwise feel endless. Exercise was taken seriously. Men walked on the ice near the ship when weather allowed, careful to avoid pressure cracks. Movement helped maintain strength and warmth. It also offered brief relief from confined spaces. Despite these efforts, psychological strain accumulated. Isolation was total. There was no expectation of contact with the outside world for months. The ship's drift continued imperceptibly, reinforcing the sense of powerlessness. Progress was no longer something that could be worked toward, only endured. Leadership became quiet and constant. Shackleton monitored morale closely, adjusting routines when tension appeared. Disputes were addressed early. Responsibilities were redistributed when fatigue became apparent. His presence remained steady, neither overly optimistic nor openly pessimistic. Outside, the ice remained in motion. Though the ship did not move relative to nearby floes, the ice field itself drifted northward. Pressure ridges formed and collapsed. Cracks opened, sometimes close enough to be heard clearly from the deck. Each sound reminded the crew that the ice was not inert. As winter deepened, the ship's role subtly shifted. Endurance was no longer a vehicle for exploration. She had become shelter, a wooden island in a frozen sea. Her survival, and that of the men aboard her, depended on withstanding forces that cannot be fought directly. The darkness persisted. Days passed without visible change. Yet beneath the stillness, tension built slowly, shaped by cold, confinement, and the knowledge that the ship's fate remained tied to the unpredictable movement of the ice around her. Winter had settled in fully, and endurance, true to her name, waited. With the return of faint daylight in late winter, changes in the ice became easier to see, and harder to ignore. The pack no longer lay evenly around Endurance. Pressure ridges rose where floes collided, piling ice into jagged walls that shifted and collapsed without warning. Cracks opened suddenly, sometimes running for hundreds of meters before sealing again with a grinding force that carried through the ship's hull. The sounds changed first. Where winter had brought long, low groans, the new season introduced sharper reports. Cracks like distant gunfire, followed by deep vibrations that resonated through the timbers. These noises often came at night, when darkness amplified their effect, and the men lay awake listening. The ice was moving more actively now. As temperatures fluctuated, floes expanded and contracted, pushing against one another. The pressure was uneven. At times it eased, allowing brief hope that the ship might be released. Then it returned, stronger than before. The hull began to feel it. Small leaks appeared where timbers flexed under strain. They were manageable at first. Pumps were used periodically, then more often. Water was cold, but not yet overwhelming. The carpenter inspected joints and beams daily, marking areas of concern. Repairs were limited by circumstance. There was no way to reinforce the hull from the outside. Everything depended on the ship's original construction and its ability to rise under pressure rather than resist it directly. This design had worked for other ships in similar conditions, but never under such sustained force. The crew responded with discipline. Pumping schedules were established. Ice was cleared away from the hull where possible, though this effort offered limited relief. Tools were kept ready at all times. Everyone understood that damage could worsen without warning. Shackleton remained calm in his assessment. He did not alarm the men unnecessarily, but he did not minimize the situation. Where once the ship had been assumed to survive the winter, contingency planning now began in earnest. Supplies were reorganized. Essential items were identified and packed so they could be moved quickly if needed. Lifeboats were inspected and adjusted. Sledges were readied. Food stores were reviewed again, this time with an eye toward survival outside the ship. The ice continued its work regardless of human preparation. One day, the pressure would ease, and the ship would lie quietly, almost peacefully. The next, floes would close again, lifting the hull slightly, twisting it just enough to test its strength. Men standing watch felt these movements directly beneath their feet. The deck tilted subtly. Objects shifted in their places. Doors jammed or swung open unexpectedly. Each change was small but cumulative. Even those who had adapted well to winter conditions found themselves waking at unfamiliar sounds. Conversations grew quieter. Attention narrowed to the ship's condition and the ice immediately surrounding it. By early October 1950, it was clear that the ice was no longer simply holding Endurance in place. It was applying sustained pressure that increased with each shift of wind and current. The ship had endured months of confinement. Now she was being tested in a more direct way. And while no single moment yet marked a point of failure, the balance between structure and force was changing. Slowly, steadily, and beyond anyone's ability to stop it. In late October 1915, the pressure on Endurance intensified beyond anything the crew had experienced before. The ice no longer shifted in brief surges. It pressed continuously, driven by wind and current that aligned in a way the ship could not escape. Floes closed from multiple directions, forcing the hull upward at an angle that strained its structure unevenly. The change was unmistakable. Timbers that had flexed now began to splinter. Beams creaked sharply, no longer absorbing pressure but resisting it. The deck warped, doors jammed in their frames. The ship listed slightly, then settled again. Each movement accompanied by the sound of wood failing under stress. Water entered more quickly. The pumps were manned constantly now, their handles moving without pause. Cold seawater poured through seams that had held for months. The carpenter and engineers worked together, shoring up weak points where possible, but the leaks outpaced their efforts. This was no longer a situation that could be managed indefinitely. Shackleton assessed the damage carefully. He moved through the ship, observing without haste, speaking little. His conclusion formed gradually but clearly. The ice was no longer testing the ship's strength. It was overcoming it. The decision came without drama. On October 27, 1915, Shackleton ordered the crew to prepare for abandonment. The command was given calmly, almost quietly. There was no alarm sounded. Each man knew what to do. The months of preparation made the transition efficient, even restrained. Essential supplies were brought up from below. Food, tents, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, navigation instruments, and medical stores were transferred to the ice. Dogs were secured. The lifeboats were hauled into position, their runners adjusted so they could be moved across the floes if necessary. Some items were left behind deliberately. Heavy equipment that could not be carried was abandoned without hesitation. The ship had served its purpose. Now survival depended on what could be moved by human strength alone. As the work continued, the hull suffered visibly. A large crack opened along the starboard side. The bow lifted, then dropped abruptly. The deck buckled in places. The sound of breaking wood carried across the ice, sharp and final. Still, there was no panic. The men worked steadily, passing crates and equipment hand to hand. Each action was deliberate. The discipline developed over months of confinement now proved essential. By evening, the ship was no longer habitable. Water flooded the lower decks. The list increased. The structure sagged under forces it could no longer resist. The decision to abandon was no longer theoretical. It had become necessary. The men moved fully onto the ice, setting up camp beside the wounded vessel. Behind them, Endurance remained upright for the moment, her mast still standing against the pale sky. She had not yet sunk. But her role had changed completely. She was no longer shelter. She was a structure in the final stages of failure, held briefly above the frozen sea by pressure that would soon complete what it had begun. The ship had endured as long as it could, and now the ice was finishing its work. With Endurance no longer able to shelter them, the ice became the crew's only ground. Camp was established a short distance from the ship, close enough to observe her condition but far enough to avoid danger if the hull shifted suddenly. Tents were pitched directly on the frozen surface. Sleeping bags were laid out on reindeer skins and spare canvas, offering minimal insulation from the cold below. The transition was abrupt. Only hours earlier, the men had lived within wooden walls. Now there was nothing between them and the Antarctic except fabric, clothing, and routine. Wind moved freely across the ice. Sound carried farther. The sense of exposure was immediate. Supplies were organized carefully. Food was stacked in accessible piles. Cooking equipment was set up with strict rules for fuel use. Medical stores were placed where they could be reached quickly. The lifeboats were positioned nearby, their hulls resting on the ice, ready to be moved if the floe cracked beneath them. Dogs were tethered and fed according to a schedule. They remained active, their movement and noise offering a strange reminder of normal life. Caring for them provided purpose, even as it consumed resources that could not be replaced. Shackleton established order quickly. Duties were assigned. Watches continued, now focused on monitoring the ice rather than the ship. Everyone understood that cracks could open without warning. Night watches were maintained despite exhaustion. From the camp, the men watched Endurance. She still stood upright, her mast silhouetted against the pale sky. The damage to her hull was clearly visible. Water surged through broken planks. Ice pressed steadily against her sides, indifferent to her design. There was little sentiment expressed openly. The ship had been home for nearly a year, but attachment had to be set aside. The men spoke about practical matters instead: weather, supplies, and the uncertain task of reaching land. Without the ship, Shackleton's objective narrowed to survival and eventual escape. The nearest land lay hundreds of kilometers away. Travel over ice with loaded boats would be slow and dangerous. For the moment, movement was postponed. Waiting became necessary. The ice continued to drift northward, carrying the camp with it. Position was recorded regularly. Each reading showed slow but measurable progress toward open water, though how long that would take was impossible to know. At night, the sounds returned. Ice shifted beneath the camp. Cracks echoed through the floe. The ship responded with groans as her structure weakened further. These sounds blended with wind and distant pressure ridges, creating a constant reminder that nothing here was stable. Despite this, routine persisted. Meals were prepared. Equipment was checked. Clothing was mended where possible. These small actions imposed structure on a situation defined by uncertainty. Endurance remained nearby, damaged but not yet destroyed. The men slept on the ice beside her, knowing that the next change might come without warning, and that when it did, the ship would no longer be able to protect them. They had left her behind in function, if not yet in sight, and the ice continued to move, carrying ship and men alike toward an outcome that could not yet be seen. For several days after the abandonment, Endurance remained upright. She stood in the ice like a structure already claimed but not yet released. Her masts still rose above the floes. Rigging hung slack. From a distance, she almost appeared unchanged, as if the damage below the waterline might still be repaired. Those closest knew better. The hull continued to deform under pressure that never fully eased. Water filled the lower decks completely. Internal bulkheads failed one by one. The ice did not rush its work. It applied force steadily, without interruption. On November 21, 1915, the final collapse came. Without warning, the ship shuddered. Her stern lifted sharply, exposing the rudder and propeller. The bow dipped. A deep cracking sound ran the length of the hull as the central structure gave way. Men in the camp watched in silence. There was nothing to be done. No tools could reach the damage. No human action could alter the outcome. The ship was no longer a vessel, but an object being reshaped by pressure. Slowly, Endurance leaned to starboard. Her decks tilted. Loose objects slid and fell. The mast shifted against the pale sky, then held briefly, as if suspended. Water surged over the rail. Ice pressed inward, filling the space where the ship had once rested. She sank not with speed, but with weight. The hull descended into the gap created by the ice, disappearing gradually beneath the surface. First the lower deck vanished, then the main deck. Finally, the stern slipped under, leaving only the tops of the masts visible for a moment longer. Then they were gone. The place where Endurance had stood closed quietly behind her. Ice moved back into position. The surface flattened. The sea beneath was sealed again, leaving no sign that a ship had ever been there. The men did not speak for some time. There was no ceremony. No words were prepared. The loss was complete and undeniable. The ship that had carried them south, sheltered them through winter, and defined the expedition was gone. With her went the last illusion of return by familiar means. The expedition, as it had been planned, ended at that moment. What remained was survival on the ice, without shelter beyond what could be carried and built by hand. Shackleton broke the silence. He reminded the men of their situation plainly and without embellishment. Their task now was to reach land. Everything they did from this point forward would serve that purpose alone. The camp remained where it was. Supplies were checked again. Rations were recalculated. The lifeboats were inspected one more time. The ice continued to drift northward, indifferent to the human loss that had just occurred. Where endurance had been, there was now only ice. And the men stood on it, facing a future that no longer included a ship, but still required endurance of another kind entirely. With the loss of endurance, the men were fully committed to the ice. They named their new settlement Ocean Camp, though it was less a place than a condition. It existed only as long as the flow beneath it remained intact. There were no fixed boundaries, no protection from wind beyond low canvas walls, and no certainty that the ground itself would last through the night. The camp was arranged with care. Tents were pitched in a loose line to reduce wind exposure. Supplies were stacked on sledges so they could be moved quickly if the ice fractured. The lifeboats were placed nearby, resting on runners made from spare wood and fittings salvaged from the ship. Daily life reorganized itself around survival on open ice. Snow was cut into blocks and melted for water. Cooking took place in sheltered pits dug into the surface where stoves were protected from wind. Fuel was used sparingly, measured by the day rather than by need. Food routines changed. Rations were reduced. Meals became simpler and more repetitive. Hunting provided occasional fresh meat, mostly seal, which was used carefully to supplement preserved stores. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled. Fat was saved for fuel when possible. The cold was constant. There was no insulation beneath the tents beyond layered skins and canvas. Heat came only from bodies, clothing, and brief use of stoves. At night, men slept fully dressed, their breath freezing on the inside of the tent fabric. Despite the hardship, routine was maintained. Watches continued. Observations were recorded. Physical activity was encouraged to prevent stiffness and cold-related illness. The camp drifted with the ice, carried slowly north by the Weddell Sea's currents. Position readings confirmed progress, but it was uneven and unpredictable. At times, the ice rotated, changing orientation without changing location. Cracks formed regularly. When pressure increased, sharp reports echoed across the floe. Men responded immediately, ready to move supplies and boats if necessary. Most cracks sealed quickly, but the threat never disappeared. Psychologically, the shift was profound. The ship had been a fixed reference point. Without it, the environment felt larger and less defined. The horizon offered no landmarks. Distance could not be judged reliably. Time blurred into a sequence of similar days. Shackleton kept focus on the future. He spoke openly about the plan to reach open water and sail to land once conditions allowed. He avoided speculation about how long it would take. Instead, he emphasized what could be done each day: maintain health, conserve resources, and remain ready to move. As weeks passed, the ice beneath Ocean Camp continued its slow journey. The men learned to read its surface. The subtle rise of pressure ridges, the dull sheen that suggested thinning ice, the sound of water moving beneath their feet. This was not travel in any traditional sense. They were passengers on a moving platform they could not control, waiting for the moment when the ice would release them, not by choice, but by breaking apart. Until then, Ocean Camp remained their world, a temporary arrangement of canvas and discipline, floating between sea and sky, sustained by routine and restraint rather than certainty. As November gave way to December 1915, the days lengthened again, but progress did not. Ocean Camp drifted steadily northward, yet the movement was imperceptible to those living on the ice. There was no sense of travel, no passing landscape. The horizon remained unchanged in every direction. a wide, pale boundary where ice met sky. Time became difficult to measure. Without landmarks, days blended together. The men relied on watches, routines, and written records to impose structure. Morning tasks repeated themselves, checking tents, inspecting cracks, tending dogs, preparing simple meals. Afternoons were filled with maintenance, quiet movement, and waiting. The ice beneath the camp changed gradually. Pressure ridges softened as temperatures rose slightly. Pools of meltwater appeared in shallow depressions, refreezing at night. These signs suggested seasonal transition, but they also introduced new hazards. Thinner ice meant greater risk of sudden breakage. The flow was no longer reliable. Shackleton recognized this shift early. He reduced the size of the camp, ordering unnecessary items discarded to lighten loads. The lifeboats were prepared for movement at short notice. Sledges were adjusted to carry people as well as supplies. Rations were reduced again. Food consumption was now calculated against an uncertain timeline. Hunting continued when conditions allowed, but seals were less predictable as the ice changed. When fresh meat was obtained, it was shared evenly and preserved where possible. Physical condition declined slowly. Despite exercise, muscle weakened from limited nutrition and constant cold. Small injuries healed slowly. Fatigue became a permanent presence rather than a temporary state, yet discipline remained. Shackleton insisted on order even when outcome was unclear. Meals were taken together. Watches were maintained. Records were kept. These actions preserved a sense of purpose when movement was impossible. The dogs sensed change. They grew restless as the ice shifted more frequently. Their behavior mirrored the instability of the environment. Managing them required additional effort, but they remained essential for hauling boats once the time came. By late December, cracks opened more often. Some ran directly beneath tents, forcing immediate relocation. Supplies were moved repeatedly, sometimes multiple times in a single day. The camp's footprint grew smaller, more temporary with each adjustment. The decision to move came gradually, not as a single order. When the flow fractured into separate pieces large enough to drift independently, Shackleton recognized that waiting was no longer an option. The men could not risk being scattered across breaking ice. The lifeboats were readied. Oars were checked. Navigation instruments were secured. Each man packed only what he could carry or help haul. Everything else was left behind without ceremony. Ocean Camp had served its purpose. It had kept them alive while the ice carried them north. Now the same ice threatened to end that protection entirely. The time for waiting had passed. Ahead lay open water, dangerous, cold, and uncertain. But it offered something the ice no longer did: the possibility of movement by choice. The change came not as a single rupture, but as a series of small failures. Cracks that once sealed themselves began to widen. The sound of water moving beneath the ice grew clearer, closer. Pressure ridges softened and slumped, no longer locked by cold. The flow beneath the men thinned unevenly, strong in some places, fragile in others. Movement became constant. Each day brought new adjustments. Tents were shifted to avoid spreading cracks. Supplies were dragged a few meters at a time, then again, then again. The lifeboats were kept ready, their runners aligned toward the nearest open leads. The ice no longer felt like ground. It flexed underfoot. At times it dipped slightly, then rose again as water surged below. These motions were subtle but unmistakable. The men learned to pause and listen before moving, to read the surface by sound and vibration as much as by sight. Shackleton watched closely. He did not wait for a dramatic break. Experience told him that large failures followed many small warnings. When the flow split into sections that drifted independently, he ordered the final preparations to be completed. There would be no further waiting. The boats were loaded with care. Weight was balanced precisely. Food, navigation tools, and sleeping gear were secured against spray. Each man knew his place and his task. Dogs were brought under control, their restlessness increasing as the ice shifted more frequently. The moment came quietly. A lead opened nearby, wide enough to show dark water moving freely between flows. Wind pushed it wider. The edge crumbled in places, breaking away with soft splashes that carried far in the still air. The boats were launched. They slid from the ice into the water, their hulls scraping briefly against the flow before floating free. Men climbed aboard quickly, steadying one another, passing oars and gear hand to hand. There was no hesitation. The ice beneath them was no longer dependable. Once afloat, the difference was immediate. The water was bitterly cold, the air sharp with spray. The boats moved heavily, loaded to their limits. Each stroke required effort. Progress was slow, but it was progress chosen, not imposed. Behind them, the ice continued to break. The flow that had carried them for months fractured into smaller pieces, drifting apart as if releasing its hold. Tents and abandoned scraps of canvas lay briefly on isolated slabs before disappearing from view. Ahead lay a scattered field of ice and open water. Navigation demanded constant attention. The boats threaded through narrow channels, sometimes stopping to wait for movement ahead, sometimes pushing forward when a lead widened unexpectedly. This was no longer endurance through stillness. It was endurance through motion, uncertain, exposed, and exhausting. Yet it offered something the ice had taken away: direction. The men rowed, adjusted, and rowed again, their course shaped by wind, current, and judgment rather than drift alone. The ice had broken, and with it the long waiting ended, replaced by a passage that would test them in different ways, not as passengers on a frozen sea, but as men moving deliberately across open water toward land they had not yet seen. Once fully afloat, the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. The three lifeboats, James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills, were never meant to carry men for extended periods through polar seas. They were sturdy, but short and low in the water, overloaded with supplies and people. Freeboard was minimal. Waves washed over the sides constantly. Every surface was wet. Spray froze where it landed. Clothing stiffened with ice. Hands numbed quickly, even through gloves. Oars had to be kept moving to prevent them from freezing into their locks. The sea itself was confused. Ice floes drifted unpredictably, colliding, separating, and rotating under the influence of wind and current. Leads that appeared open could close suddenly. Boats were forced to stop, backwater, or change direction with little warning. Navigation was cautious and continuous. Shackleton and Worsley coordinated movements between the boats, keeping them within sight of one another whenever possible. Separation in these conditions would almost certainly prove fatal. Signals were simple and direct: shouts, gestures, changes in course. Rowing was exhausting. Men took turns at the oars, their strength already diminished by months on the ice. Muscles burned quickly. Rest periods were brief and irregular. There was no opportunity to stretch fully or warm up properly. Food was eaten cold. Cooking was rarely possible. Fuel was reserved for emergencies. Biscuits were soaked in seawater to make them chewable. Occasional pieces of preserved meat were shared out carefully. Eating was functional rather than comforting. Sleep came in fragments. Men lay curled in the bottoms of the boats when not rowing, trying to shield themselves from spray and wind. Movement of the boat prevented deep rest. Every wave threatened to swamp them if balance was lost. Despite these conditions, discipline held. Each man knew his role. Oars were passed smoothly. Commands were followed without question. Fatigue was acknowledged but not allowed to dominate decision-making. The goal was simple: reach land. No one could say exactly when or where that would happen. Charts offered only rough guidance. The ice field extended for miles, its edges shifting daily. The boats moved whenever leads allowed and waited when they did not. Days passed this way. The rhythm of rowing, waiting, and adjusting repeated itself under skies that rarely changed. Wind burned faces raw. Salt-crusted clothing. The cold settled deep into bones. Occasionally, a wider stretch of open water appeared. These moments were taken advantage of immediately. Oars dug in harder. Progress increased briefly before narrowing ice forced another slowdown. The boats remained intact. Leaks were managed by bailing. Minor damage was repaired as best as possible while afloat. Nothing could be allowed to fail completely. The men endured, not through strength alone, but through attention. Every movement mattered, every decision carried consequence. Survival depended on small corrections made continuously. The ice had released them into motion. Now the sea demanded its own kind of endurance. One measured in steady strokes, restrained judgment, and the ability to continue when every condition argued for stopping. Land appeared first as a dark line beneath low cloud. After days in the boats, the sight was almost unreal. The shoreline rose sharply from the sea, a mass of rock and ice without trees or visible shelter. Waves broke heavily against it, throwing spray high into the air. This was not the land they had hoped for, but it was land nonetheless. Elephant Island lay at the edge of the Antarctic Peninsula, remote and uninhabited. Reaching it did not end their danger. The approach was difficult. Swell and wind made landing hazardous, and the boats were at constant risk of being smashed against rock. Timing mattered. The men waited for brief lulls, then rowed hard, driving the boats forward with what strength remained. The landing was abrupt. The boats grounded roughly on a narrow strip of beach. Men leapt into icy water to steady them, dragging hulls clear of the surf before the next wave could reclaim them. Hands burned with cold. Muscles protested sharply after days of confinement. For the first time in months, they stood on solid ground. The relief was immediate but restrained. There was no celebration. The island offered no safety beyond temporary stability. Wind tore across the beach. Snow fell intermittently. The terrain rose steeply inland, broken by ice-covered slopes and loose rock. Shelter had to be built quickly. The overturned boats were hauled above the tide line and propped on stones to create low roofs. Canvas and sailcloth were stretched between them. This arrangement offered minimal protection, but it blocked some wind and trapped a small amount of warmth. The men organized themselves methodically. Sleeping areas were assigned. Cooking equipment was set up where it could be shielded from gusts. Supplies were inventoried again, now with the understanding that no further movement could be made until a new plan emerged. Food remained scarce. Seal and penguin hunting resumed when possible, providing fresh meat and fat. These meals were prepared carefully, often boiled for long periods to extract maximum nourishment. Fuel use was tightly controlled. Water was obtained by melting snow and ice. This required constant attention, as containers froze quickly. Everything took longer in the cold. Simple tasks demanded planning and patience. As days passed, the reality of their position became clear. Elephant Island lay far from shipping routes. No one would pass by accidentally. Rescue could not be expected unless it was actively sought. Shackleton recognized this immediately. He gathered the men and spoke plainly. Waiting without action would lead only to gradual decline. The only realistic option was to send a small party in one of the boats to reach a place where help could be found. South Georgia lay more than 800 miles away. The journey would cross some of the most dangerous ocean on Earth in a boat already worn by weeks of exposure. Yet it was the only path that offered a chance of rescue. The decision was not debated. Everyone understood the stakes. Those remaining on Elephant Island would have to survive on limited resources, uncertain how long they would wait, or whether they would ever see the others again. Preparation began immediately. The strongest boat, James Caird, was selected for modification. The men worked with care, altering its structure to improve stability and seaworthiness. Every adjustment was made with the knowledge that there would be no second attempt. Elephant Island became a place of waiting. The men settled into a routine shaped by cold, hunger, and expectation. Each day followed the last with little variation. The shoreline remained unchanged. The sea continued its movement without regard for their plans. They had reached land. But the journey was far from over. Work on the boat became the focus of every waking hour. The James Caird was hauled higher onto the beach and turned on its side. Its hull showed the marks of strain. Seams worked loose, planks swollen and warped by constant wet and cold. These weaknesses were addressed as carefully as possible with the materials at hand. Wood scraps were fitted where gaps appeared. Nails were reused, straightened, and driven again. Canvas was sewn into makeshift decking to cover the open hull, forming a low shelter against waves and spray. Sealskins were stretched and lashed into place to reinforce seams and provide additional waterproofing. Everything was improvised. There were no spare parts, no chance to test changes properly. Decisions were made based on experience and necessity. The goal was not comfort, but survival. Ballast was added. Stones were placed carefully along the keel to lower the boat's center of gravity. Weight was balanced with precision. Too much would slow progress. Too little would leave the boat unstable in heavy seas. Navigation instruments were selected next. Only the most essential tools were taken: a sextant, a chronometer, charts worn thin from use. Every item was checked repeatedly. There would be no replacements once they left the beach. Food supplies were divided. Rations for the boat party were calculated with care, balancing weight against the likelihood of delay. Portions were small by design. Hunger would be unavoidable, but starvation had to be delayed long enough to reach land. Those remaining on Elephant Island watched quietly. There was little to say. The work was practical, steady, and focused. Conversation stayed brief, often centered on immediate tasks rather than what lay ahead. When the boat was ready, Shackleton chose the men who would go. The selection was based on strength, skill, and temperament. Each man had to be capable of working under extreme stress, able to row, navigate, and endure prolonged exposure without breaking discipline. The farewell was simple. There were no speeches, no promises. Each man understood the uncertainty of what was being attempted. Hands were shaken. Brief words were exchanged. Then attention returned to final checks and preparations. The launch took place in difficult conditions. Wind pressed against the shore. Waves surged unevenly. Timing again mattered. The boat was pushed into the water during a brief opening, steadied by men waist-deep in the surf until it floated free. The James Caird turned toward the open sea. Those left behind watched until it became a small shape against the gray water, then disappeared entirely. The sound of waves quickly erased any trace of its passage. On Elephant Island, waiting resumed. The remaining men returned to their shelters, adjusting routines to account for fewer hands. Hunting, cooking, and maintenance continued as before, though now every day carried the added weight of uncertainty. Out at sea, the James Caird faced its own reality. The boat rose and fell sharply in the swell. Water forced its way through seams despite every precaution. Bailing became constant. Navigation demanded full attention as wind and current threatened to push them off course. There would be no turning back. The voyage toward South Georgia had begun, a passage defined by exposure, precision, and the narrow margin between endurance and failure. The sea asserted itself immediately. Long swells rolled beneath the James Caird, lifting it high before dropping it sharply into troughs of dark water. Spray broke over the bow and froze where it landed. The deck covering reduced some exposure, but nothing could keep the boat dry for long. Everything was damp. Clothing never fully dried. Sleeping bags absorbed moisture and stiffened with salt. Hands were constantly wet, skin cracking and whitening from prolonged cold. The men rotated tasks to manage exhaustion, but relief was limited. Navigation required precision under pressure. Worsley took sextant readings whenever the sky allowed, often balancing himself precariously while timing glimpses of the sun between cloud breaks. Errors of even a few miles could prove fatal. There was no room for drift. Shackleton monitored morale closely. Conversation was kept calm and deliberate. Commands were clear and unambiguous. When fatigue slowed reactions, he adjusted watches and duties to prevent mistakes from compounding. Food was rationed carefully. Meals were brief and functional. Small portions of biscuit, melted ice water, occasional hot drinks when fuel allowed. Warmth from these moments was temporary but meaningful. Sleep came in short intervals. Men lay pressed against one another beneath the deck covering, sharing body heat. Movement of the boat made rest shallow and easily broken. Dreams, when they came, were brief and indistinct. Storms tested the boat repeatedly. Winds strengthened without warning, forcing constant course adjustments. Waves struck from unexpected angles. The boat creaked under strain, seams opening and closing with each impact. Bailing never stopped for long. Water accumulated faster during rough weather, forcing men to work pumps and buckets continuously. Arms ached, hands numbed, yet no one slowed enough to let water gain the upper hand. The cold intensified. Temperatures dropped further south. Ice formed along the gunwales. When it accumulated too heavily, it had to be chipped away carefully to prevent capsizing. The horizon rarely changed. Sky and sea merged into a narrow band of gray. Still, the course held. Despite storms and fatigue, navigation remained accurate. Worsley's calculations placed them within reach of South Georgia, a narrow margin, but enough. The knowledge that land might be possible sustained them, not as excitement, but as discipline. Each man focused on the next task, the next adjustment, the next watch. The Southern Ocean did not relent, but neither did they. The James Caird pressed forward, carrying 6 men across one of the most unforgiving seas on Earth. Not through strength alone, but through constant attention, shared resolve, and the refusal to surrender. Precision to exhaustion. Land appeared through cloud and mist, jagged and abrupt. The mountains of South Georgia rose steeply from the sea, their slopes streaked with snow and ice. After weeks of exposure, the sight carried no immediate comfort. Reaching the island did not mean safety. The coastline was hostile, lined with cliffs and surf-heavy bays. The James Caird was pushed hard in the final approach. Wind drove the boat toward the shore at an angle, threatening to smash it against rock. Navigation narrowed to immediate survival, finding any stretch of coastline where a landing might be possible. They found one. A small cove offered limited shelter. The boat was run aground deliberately, driven onto the beach with the last coordinated effort of the crew. Men collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to move further. They had reached land, but the landing point lay on the uninhabited side of the island. The whaling stations were on the far coast, separated by a mountainous interior no one in the group had ever crossed. The boat could not continue. Its condition, and the men's, made further sailing impossible. A new decision had to be made quickly. Shackleton chose 2 men to remain behind with the boat while he and 2 others would attempt a crossing on foot. The journey would traverse glaciers, ridges, and unknown terrain without proper equipment. Preparation was minimal. Ropes were improvised. An adze served as an ice tool. Clothing was adjusted as best as possible for movement rather than warmth. Supplies were divided again, now reduced to what could be carried. The crossing began without delay. They moved inland immediately, climbing steep slopes slick with ice and snow. Footing was uncertain. Progress was slow and exhausting, but stopping was not an option. They traveled without rest. Fear of freezing during sleep drove them onward. Night and day blurred into a continuous effort of climbing, sliding, and navigating by instinct and limited visibility. The terrain offered no gentle passages. Ridges rose sharply, then dropped away into unseen valleys. Glaciers cracked beneath them. Snow concealed crevasses that could not be reliably detected. At times, they slid down slopes deliberately, using controlled falls to descend faster where climbing down would be too slow. Sound became important. They listened for running water, for wind direction, for the distant echo of surf that might signal proximity to the coast. These cues guided decisions when sight failed. After more than a day of continuous movement, they heard something unexpected. A sound not made by wind or ice. A whistle. It was faint, but unmistakably human. Soon after, the shapes of buildings appeared below, the whaling station at Stromness. Smoke rose from chimneys. Machinery noise carried faintly across the snow. They had crossed the island. The arrival was abrupt. Their appearance startled the station workers. Bearded, unwashed, clothed in tattered garments, they looked more like apparitions than men who had crossed an ocean. Assistance came quickly. Food, warmth, and medical attention were provided. Rest followed, heavy and immediate. But Shackleton's attention did not linger on relief. His thoughts returned immediately to Elephant Island. Rescue was now possible. The journey was not yet complete. Rest was brief. Once Shackleton recovered enough to act, preparations for rescue began immediately. The men at the whaling station offered assistance without hesitation. Plans were made quickly, then revised as realities intervened. The first attempt used a small whaling vessel. It did not get far. Ice conditions around Elephant Island were severe, far worse than anticipated. Pack ice blocked progress, grinding against the hull and forcing a retreat before the ship could reach open approach routes. A second attempt followed. Again, ice prevailed. Wind and current compressed flows into dense barriers that no wooden ship could safely force. Each failure meant returning, reassessing, and waiting for conditions to change. Time passed heavily. Every delay carried weight. Shackleton knew precisely what waiting meant on Elephant Island. Limited shelter, dwindling supplies, constant exposure. The Southern Ocean dictated terms without regard for intent or preparation. Ships advanced when allowed and stopped when denied. Throughout these failures, Shackleton did not waver. He maintained constant readiness, monitoring ice reports, weather changes, and any indication that a passage might open. Supplies were kept prepared. Crews remained on alert. Finally, assistance came from an unexpected source. The Chilean government offered the use of the Yelko, a small steam-powered tugboat not designed for polar conditions. It lacked heavy reinforcement and carried minimal insulation. It was a risk, but it was also an opportunity. The Yelko departed as soon as conditions permitted. Speed mattered. The Yelcho advanced steadily, carefully, with constant vigilance. Then Elephant Island appeared. The shoreline was exactly as Shackleton remembered it. stark, exposed, unchanged. Smoke rose faintly from the beach. The men were still alive. The approach was tense. Ice threatened to close at any moment. The Yelcho did not linger. It maneuvered as close as possible, and the men on shore reacted immediately. There was no celebration. Supplies and people were loaded quickly. Every movement was efficient. No one hesitated, aware that delay could trap the ship. All hands were accounted for. Against all odds, every man left on Elephant Island survived the months of waiting. As the Yelcho turned away from the shore, ice began to close behind it. The rescue had come at the last possible moment. The expedition, in its original purpose, had failed. But the survival of every man stood as its own achievement, one forged through endurance, restraint, leadership, and an unwavering refusal to abandon those left behind. The journey ended quietly. There was no parade, no formal moment that marked the closing of the expedition. The men were delivered back into the world gradually, first to the safety of ports, then to ships bound north, and finally to lives that had continued in their absence. The Endurance itself was gone. Crushed months earlier beneath the pressure of the ice, it now lay on the ocean floor, preserved in darkness and cold. Its loss marked the end of the original goal, a trans-Antarctic crossing that was never completed. Yet the expedition became something else. What remained was not a story of discovery, but of survival, of decisions made under uncertainty, of leadership shaped less by authority than by attention and care, of men who endured not because they were immune to fear or fatigue, but because they adapted continuously to conditions they could not control. The Antarctic returned to silence. The ice drifted as it always had. Snow covered the traces left on Elephant Island. Camps vanished. Footprints faded. Nothing permanent remained where men had once waited for rescue. Years later, the significance of the expedition would be understood more clearly. It would be remembered not for maps redrawn or territory claimed, but for restraint, for knowing when to stop, when to wait, and when to move. For choosing survival over ambition. The Southern Ocean continued to shape ships and men alike. Storms still rose without warning. Ice still shifted unpredictably. The environment remained unchanged by human intention. But the story endured, not as a triumph over nature, but as a record of how humans moved within it, carefully, imperfectly, and sometimes just barely enough. The expedition passed into history. What remained was the quiet understanding that endurance is not measured by conquest, but by the ability to persist, to care for others, and to hold together when the world offers no certainty at all. Long after the men were gone, the places they had occupied continued without them. On Elephant Island, the beach returned to its original stillness. Wind erased the shallow depressions where tents once stood. Stones used to weigh down canvas shifted back into the general scatter of the shore. Bones left from seals and penguins were gradually carried away by scavengers or buried beneath snow. Nothing marked the months of waiting. The island did not remember the voices, the routines, or the careful rationing of heat and food. It returned to what it had always been, exposed, indifferent, shaped only by weather and time. Far below the surface of the Weddell Sea, the Endurance rested where it had finally settled. Cold preserved it. Darkness surrounded it. The hull, once pressed and groaning under the force of ice, lay intact in still water. Wood did not rot there as it would elsewhere. The ship became part of the seabed, not broken apart, but absorbed into silence. For decades it remained unseen. Above it, ice continued its slow movement. Storms crossed the ocean. Whales passed. Nothing disturbed the ship's position. It existed without witness, without purpose, without memory. On land, the men resumed ordinary lives. Some returned to sea. Others found work far from ice and wind. The habits formed during the expedition lingered quietly: attention to small details, patience with delay, an understanding of how quickly conditions can change. The story was told and retold. Often it was simplified, reduced to moments of leadership or singular decisions. Yet the reality had been less dramatic and more continuous. A long sequence of careful adjustments, restraint, and endurance sustained over time. The expedition did not change Antarctica. It changed how people spoke about it, not as a place to be conquered easily, but as a place that demanded humility. A place where success could mean simply surviving without loss. Years later, when the wreck of the Endurance was found again, intact beneath the ice, it confirmed something already known. The environment had not erased the expedition. It had held it, preserved it quietly, without commentary or judgment. What remains is not only a ship beneath the sea or a name in history, but an understanding. That endurance is rarely loud, rarely triumphant, and often invisible once it is past. The ice closed again, and the world continued on, unchanged, carrying only the quiet trace of those who had once moved carefully across it. In the end, the expedition did not leave monuments. There were no roads, no permanent structures, no settlements that carried its name forward through daily use. What it left instead was a pattern, a way of understanding how people move through uncertainty when force and certainty are unavailable. The men of the Endurance learned to live within limits. They learned how little warmth could be stretched when bodies were close together, how food could be divided so that no one took more than another, how tools could be repaired and reused until they became almost unrecognizable from their original form. They learned the rhythm of waiting. Not passive waiting, but attentive waiting. Watching the ice, the wind, the sky. Learning when to act and when to remain still. Accepting that many outcomes were beyond control, but not all decisions were. Leadership in this place was quiet. It appeared in the steady repetition of routines, in calm voices during moments when panic would have solved nothing, in choosing patience over urgency when the environment demanded restraint. The Antarctic itself remained unchanged. It did not reward effort. It did not respond to courage. It offered neither mercy nor cruelty, only conditions. Ice moved. Winds shifted. Temperatures fell and rose without concern for human plans. And yet, within that indifference, the men endured. Not because they mastered the environment, but because they adapted to it. Because they paid attention to one another. Because they accepted limits and worked carefully within them. As time passed, the story settled into history. It became something read, spoken, and remembered, often during quieter moments when the world felt uncertain in different ways. Its meaning shifted with each retelling, but its core remained unchanged. Endurance was not found in victory. It was found in persistence without spectacle, in survival without domination, in the decision, repeated daily, to continue carefully rather than to rush blindly forward. The ice closed. The sea moved on, and the expedition became what it always had been, not a conquest of the Antarctic, but a record of human steadiness in a place that offered no guarantees at all. The story rests there now, quiet, complete, unmoving, and, like the ice itself, it remains.